Welcome to the second episode of Books of Titans. I'm Jason Staples, together with Erik Rostad, and this podcast is dedicated to the influences of influencers, the books that have helped shape the prominent inventors, business leaders, athletes, intellectuals, scientists, and other thought leaders of our time. We'll talk about what makes these books so important and influential, and we'll at least attempt to have an intelligent discussion on these important works. Today we're going to cover The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway, a book focused on an old man in the sea, really an old man's efforts to catch a great fish on the sea. Really a remarkable book. I mean, I enjoyed it a lot more than I expected, but first let's talk about who recommended the book. That was Jack Dorsey, the co-founder, CEO of Twitter, the founder of Square. That is, of course, the guy you can find at Jack on Twitter, which shows just how early he was on his platform. I don't know if there's anything more you want to say about Jack Dorsey, Erik, before we get into a little bit about the author.
Only to say that a few years ago, I listened to the audiobook of Hatching Twitter, and it was quite a mess. that company is I'm surprised they're still around, actually.
Not as much of a mess as Uber.
Could be up there. Could be up there.
Yeah, if anybody writes that expose on Uber, then wow.
Yeah, that'll be a good one. Well, Ernest Hemingway, obviously the author of The Old Man and the Sea. Won't go into too much about him, but he did see a lot of war. He was an American novelist. He enlisted in World War I as an ambulance driver. And during the Spanish Civil War was a journalist. And as well as in World War II, he's president at the Normandy landings. So I think we can conclude that he observed some war and had a good understanding of war. Late in life, had an unfortunate encounter with a shotgun. His father, sister, and brother also committed suicide.
Wow, I don't know that that's how I would put committed suicide, but okay. Wow.
Well, it's better than he died. The back of the book that I have here of The Old Man and the Sea says he died in 1961.
Yes, he did
die.
He did unfortunately commit suicide, which, as you mentioned, was something that apparently ran in his family, tragically.
Yep. So going on to our next section of our favorite quotes. My favorite quote from the book was towards the beginning, and it's when they're talking about a Brooklyn baseball player being in Cuba, and they didn't have the guts to ask him if he would go fishing with them. And the old man says, "I know, it was a great mistake. He might have gone with us. Then we would have had that for all our lives." I saw it was such a neat quote. We would have had that for all of our lives. Just thinking about decisions you make, doing one thing or being too shy to not do it. The risk of asking is being rejected. The risk of not asking is not having that for the rest of your life and being something that you could look back at. So there's a lot of cool little language things that Hemingway does in this book, but that one stuck out to me in particular as being pretty neat.
Yeah, so that line, it's interesting too because it sets up so much about this story, because you have this. The whole point is that he was talking about how this great baseball player would have been great to take him fishing, but I was too timid to ask, and I asked you to ask him, and you were too timid, and it's this dealing with regret about not being willing to take the risk, and to take the big risk, which in this case was not a big risk. It's just something as small as inviting someone to come fishing, and how that one experience can really make a difference and color the rest of life, and again, I like that quote as well. This idea, then we would have that for all of our lives. And this one thing that, sometimes making one little decision or taking one little risk can make such a big difference. And I think we see that in the rest of the book as well. Now, as is my custom, I couldn't choose a favorite quote. I kind of have two.
We may need to retitle your section to quotes.
Favorite quotes. And I suppose I should put the one in the spoiler section, so we'll wait for that one. But the one that I can put in here before we get to the post-spoiler section is, "Fish," he said, "I love you and respect you very much, but I will kill you dead before this day ends." I just love that line. "I love you and respect you very much, but I will kill you dead before this day ends." And, there's so much, we'll get to this in a moment, but there's so much about love in this book and about respect and certain, and sort of embodying that. And there's so much of that in this book that I think this saying, or this particular statement here, this quote, again, brings out some of those themes that pop up throughout the book, and that really give this book a lot of meat, a lot of depth. But we'll wait for the second quote for the nitty gritty, the spoiler zone after that. But now we can go ahead and get into our overview and initial reaction, sort of big picture stuff with respect to this book. And Erik, you have, I think, a little bit more than me to start with here.
Yeah, and one of the first things, I'm really looking forward to this episode and just discussing it, because part of me doesn't know why I like this book. It's one of I consider it to be one of my favorite books. I read it in college, the first time I ever read it, and this is the second or third time. I may have read it a couple times towards the beginning when I was reading it. And just something stuck out about it. The main thing I remember is the grittiness of it. Hemingway's description of the man and the pain he's going through trying to reel this fish in, not with our modern fishing technology, in his hands, the line being on his hands and digging in and cutting his hands. You can almost feel that happening. So I loved that grittiness. I enjoyed. It's a small book, but it seems like there's so much in the book.
It's so vivid. That's the thing, right? I mean, you can, like, not only do you feel the injuries to it's so well described, but you can actually kind of feel the fatigue as well. That's something I really noticed about it. It's beautiful. Yeah,
I loved that. I gifted the book to my dad. At that time in my life, I didn't gift a lot of books, and so that was just something I remember that I did gift that to my dad. One other initial reaction, and this is something I also remember from that first time I read it, is his description. When the old man is talking about the ocean, he calls it la mar in Spanish, and that's not the right. It's el mar. It's a masculine word, but the old man has such adoration for the sea and respect for the sea that he calls it la mar. He feminizes it. And in the book, he said that's what people call her in Spanish when they love her. And I just thought it was so cool. And so anytime I see the ocean, I think of that line, la mar, just the beauty and the respect for that beauty that the old man has. I thought that was awesome.
Well, and you got to keep in mind, too, that Hemingway he lived in Cuba in the 1940s and 50s. So, I mean, he was around fishermen just like this quite a bit, and also in Key West in the 1930s. So, I mean, you think about that's 30 years of his life, 3 decades of his life, and the 2 decades immediately prior to writing this book, where he's around a lot of these types of fishermen. And, those in Cuba, I imagine that he probably got that from there, where some of those men probably did call the sea la mar rather than el mar, because of the attachment to the sea and again feminizing it, which I think is indeed really interesting. It's an interesting way to show that, I suppose.
Yeah, I guess similar, not to the degree, but similar to people referring to their cars in the feminine, of saying that she, calling their car she. But this one had a little more beauty to it, I think.
Yeah, I agree with that. But let's, so then you already talked about the grittiness here. One of the things that I really got out of this book and sort of paid attention to pretty closely is this, and I think this might get to one of, you sort of talked about how this is one of your favorite books and you're not exactly sure why. I think there's a few things here. One is the subtle sort of philosophy that underpins the book, and the philosophical questions that the book gets to sort of indirectly without actually directly making philosophical claims or philosophical statements. The book has, I think, a lot of philosophy to get across. Specifically, there is a and one of the quotes that you mentioned there in terms of the Lamar is a good example of this. There's a real love of nature in this book, and specifically a calling to the beauty of nature. There's this book. One of the things that you see in a lot of particularly classical philosophy is a discussion of the beautiful and the good, sort of as principles, and seeing and looking for the good or the beautiful in the design of the cosmos and all these things. And the way that he writes, and specifically what he writes about here, I think in a lot of ways try to bring that across. And at the same time, while we keep being drawn to, and he keeps drawing our attention to the beautiful, it's at the same time, those things are also dangerous. They're involved with death. Wherever we see beauty, we see the sort of mortality of it all, and that to me is one of the real paradoxes of this work, is the way that there's that discussion or that juxtaposition of really beautiful of not just beautiful prose, but bringing across beauty, and specifically beauty in the mundane, right? I mean, this is somebody just going out to fish. And, half the book is basically talking about, small talk between, the old man and a boy, and, eating together and little, these are mundane. Like, it's the most routine stuff. Now, of course, a good portion of the book is not the routine, but it's actually when the routine becomes hyper real and becomes life and death and all those things. But what Hemingway seems to me to really be pushing here in this book is the beauty of the mundane, and at the same time recognizing the impermanence of it all, and how beauty calls to something beyond that impermanence, and that and that there's a sort of eternal beauty wrapped up in the mortality of this world, and there's something. I just kept seeing that page after page. Of course, I didn't actually read this in page form, but actually listened to the Charlton Heston version, the audiobook version, which I cannot recommend enough. In preparation for this episode, I listened to the Heston version, which he read it the way Old Man and the Sea should be read. But to me, I think that's a big reason that this book is so good and calls out so well, is that it calls to something deep within us in dealing with the beauty of the mundane, and forcing us to focus on things that we ordinarily would pass over. Thinking about just about the birds circling overhead and what that might mean, and how beautiful that actually is, the flight of a bird or the flight of various birds. And, you get this other quote here when he's got these couple porpoises that are around the boat, and he says, "They are good," he said. "They play and make jokes and love one another. They are our brothers, like the flying fish." And, again, it's this thinking of nature as not something else really, but as something that we're wrapped up in, that we're a part of, as a part of this cosmos. And at the same time, something has to die in order for us to live, and things have to die in order for us to live, and and ultimately we will die. But there is this tragic beauty in the midst of all of it. To me, that was my big picture sort of initial reaction to this book. And, I liked it more than I expected to, and more than really, you would expect to like a book that is not really about, something grand or whatnot. It is about the mundane. And I think that's really the secret sauce of Hemingway in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm. The mundane, but also in this small world. I mean, the whole thing takes place either on the shore or out in the sea of one country. You're not going to all these different places. It's an old man going into a boat, going into the sea. But like you said, everything is there. The porpoises, they're like our brothers, the flying fish. It's the animals he's seeing. It's the daily part of his life, but he sees the joy. He sees the I can't think of the word, but just of the marlin, the majesty, I guess, of the marlin, and those are the big things to him.
Well, and again, it gets back to the love and respect of nature and of the other participants around him, not just other people, but just love and respect for his environment and for everything that he sees around him, and an appreciation of living in that moment. Mm-hmm. And that's something, we hear all the time about mindfulness, and we're going to, talk about that on this podcast probably quite a bit. But, this is in that way this is a very mindful story. And in that sense, reading it or listening to it is a very meditative thing. This is a meditative story. It's very mindful. It forces you to slow down and think about think about how that fish would actually look, or think about how those birds actually are interacting with their surroundings, and just sit and look rather than hurrying through life. And this book is short, but the amount of time that it's actually covering is really short, right? I mean, the vividness of the narration, it's crawling initially, especially, and that, I think, is part of the beauty of it. Is, again, it's forcing us to slow down our pace, and instead of going through life just running past all of these really miraculous and beautiful things that we could see if we would just take the time to be mindful and live in that moment. Instead, we're speeding toward death really quickly. But this old man is ready to die, and so he's not speeding towards anything quickly. He's doing stuff. He's taking the time to drink up the last few details before he does eventually die. And I think that's where I think the subtle philosophy of living in the moment and appreciating what little you may have, and appreciating the beauty that is just around you, even if you have nothing, the beauty of nature and the beauty of how things are interconnected and all that, it's all there. And to me, that makes this book really, really worthwhile.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And as we move into the next section of nitty gritty, that's exactly one of the main reasons I liked this book. It almost gave a little nostalgia to me. I spent a lot of time when I was a kid with my grandpa on a boat. We'd be fishing in Wisconsin, and there's one quote from this book where it says, "It was considered a virtue not to talk unnecessarily at sea," and that just reminds me of my grandpa. I mean, we would talk, but it was mostly, you were there to fish, And me being a kid, I just wanted to get back on land where we could build a fire and make s'mores, or play games in the lodge, or just
do
something
right?
else. Yeah. And my grandpa would always talk. When he did talk there, it was about enjoying that moment and taking a look around. And yeah, you might sit there for 2 or 3 hours and not catch a fish, but there's a lot to look at. There's a lot going on, and there doesn't need to be all this talking or grand things going on. But there's a lot of beauty in that. And now I look back at those times as really precious times with my grandfather, and really peaceful times.
Yeah, and again, that gets back to this, fishing is, and one of the reasons that so many people like fishing is that done the right way, with this, not talking unnecessarily throughout, is a meditative practice, right? You go out and you just, you do your preparation and all this, and then you wait.
Mm-hmm.
And this is one of the benefits. Actually, this is one of the beauties of one of the reasons that I am so grateful for the woman that I married. Is one of the things that we really both like about our particular relationship is both of us are fairly significant introverts, such that we get home from being out in public and everything, and we need a break from people. And to some extent, we don't count, for that, sort of fatigue there, because of the openness that we have with each other. But at the same point, it's lovely for each of us to be married to someone that we can sit down on the couch for an hour, hour and a half, 2 hours, and read, or do or do nothing, and not say a word. Yeah. And just enjoy being in each other's presence without actually saying anything. And that's something I really appreciate. I find a great pleasure. And again, this is something that you get out of these kinds of it was considered a virtue not to talk unnecessarily at sea, right? I mean, and your grandfather was probably, what did your grandfather do for a living?
Well, he sold insurance. When he was younger, he was a farmer. So he was a farmer for many years, and then he sold life insurance for probably the last 20 years of his working life. So
lots of talking.
Lots of talking.
And lots of moving around, right? I mean, he's probably not just in an office at one place all the time.
Yeah. Yep. And I mean, he's still going strong. He's 94 years old now. Actually, he's started to deteriorate, but up into his 90s, he was still very, very strong and moved around a lot. And so, I think it's a good segue into the old man and the boy of this story as well, because that quote, if I remember correctly, in the book comes from the boy. It was considered a virtue not to talk necessarily at sea, but what we see almost the whole time, and what you really before we started recording, what you discussed and what really something I guess I hadn't thought about was just how much the old man wanted the boy's presence there with him at sea, even if there wasn't, like you just described with you and your wife, there didn't need to be a constant conversation, but the presence. And I really liked what you had started to tell me about how you saw the boy and the old man's relationship in this story, and in the ramifications of that.
Yeah, I mean, and actually, this quote it came from after the boy had left. He's out on the surface at the beginning, and it's when he begins to talk to himself. Okay. And it says, it was considered a virtue not to talk unnecessarily at sea, and the old man had always considered it so and respected it. But now he said his thoughts aloud many times, since there was no one that they could annoy, right? So it's kind of continuing his meditative practice. He can speak out loud for himself, but there's no one out there to annoy, no silence really to break. But yeah, I getting to this other piece of the nitty gritty of this book. I thought the book was in so many ways really about it's about a lot of things, but one of the major themes is the relationship between the man and the boy. In so many pages, it's like, depending on what version you have, probably about the first, sixth of the book or so is just the man and having his discussion and interactions with this boy who cares about him. Mm-hmm. And then at different points during his time out at sea, as he's trying to catch this great marlin, we get this little refrain over, a few times where the man thinks, here's one place he says, "I wish I had the boy to help me and to see this. No one should be alone in their old age," he thought, "but it is unavoidable." And that's one of those things that it's like, that again, the vividness of that kind of thinking and putting yourself in the man's shoes of, this is an old guy who barely has enough to eat. He's only surviving. He actually admits to himself because the boy has been supplying him with enough food to eat. And now he's in the process of trying to catch this giant fish. And now he wishes he had the boy both to help, but also to share in the triumph and to share in the struggle and to share in the fight. And, that's the other thing is, and that's one of the beauties, again, about being married and for me and my wife is that, we may not have to say anything, but we can experience the same thing. And you don't have to be married for that. That's one of the reasons that, going to a movie or to a show or going hiking and all that, or camping, or there's some virtue to doing some of those things alone, and particularly if you just need the space. But more often than not, we really just don't get as much out of doing stuff, out of our experiences, unless we have someone else to share it with. Mm-hmm. And when we have someone who we can look back and go, "Man, do you remember when we did X?" You may not have said a word during that whole story, but just being able to share an experience with someone, there's something so fundamental to that about with our humanity, as to our humanity. Mm-hmm. And this book really hammers that out about how we human beings are not solitary. We don't do well alone, and we're not alone in the world. We're a part of a much larger cosmos and a much larger interaction of organisms and all of this other stuff. But at bottom, what we really want is another human being to be able to share experiences with, and to have respect from, to be able to love, and to be able to be lovely to. That's the old Adam Smith idea that what people really want is to love and to be lovely. Mm-hmm. This is what this is about. And, this gets back to then, the philosophy that's buried in this book it really is about how social ties and mundane everyday relationships, just having someone to spend time with and to share your struggles and victories and defeats with is what keeps us alive. And actually, the thing is, the old man at the end of the story, and now that we're in the spoiler zone, the old man does get what he hopes for. He doesn't get back with the fish intact, and that's the sort of tragedy of the story. But at the end of the story, the old man actually gets what he really needs and what he really wants. He gets respect. He's no longer, unlucky. He's no longer, the boy will be able to come out with him now.
And that's kind of the irony of the whole thing too, is the boy couldn't come because he wasn't successful. The boy's parents, and the irony is that he if he would have been out with the old man, that would have been the experience of a lifetime. He would have learned more than he would have learned going out with.
And they'd have been able to bring the fish back, right?
Yeah, they would have brought the fish back, but instead they just bring the shell of the fish back. I mean, the old man just brings the shell of the fish back.
The skeleton, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so, I mean, and that, again, gets back to we can't win. We can't actually have real victories and so on without each other, without having someone else that we share it with. It's not really it's one of those things like, did you actually have a hole in one if nobody else was there to see it? Right? Does it really count if you're the only one that saw it? Like, you can't share that someone else was there and regardless if they need to vouch for you or not, it's the sharing of that experience that really makes it precious.
Well, I think it counts if you Snapchat it alone. But that's the only time it counts.
Yeah, but you got to actually record it, right? Yeah, and then Snapchat it so that it will vaporize in a minute. Yeah.
So you could. That's the bad thing about it, though. It's gone.
Yeah, well, that's not going to work for me, but yeah. So that to me is a big piece of, again, what makes this such a really interesting and worthwhile read. And now we can get to a couple other quotes that I really liked. I mean, the other favorite quote that, it's just, again, there's a little sarcasm in here. But it's where the old man is reflecting, perhaps it was a sin to kill the fish. I suppose it was, even though I did it to keep me alive and feed many people. But then everything is a sin. Do not think about sin. It's much too late for that, and there are people who are paid to do it. Let them think about it. You were born to be a fisherman, as the fish was born to be a fish. San Pedro was a fisherman, as was the father of the great DiMaggio. And there's something there, again, first of all, there are people paid to think about sin, so don't worry about that. That's a nice little tongue-in-cheek line. But there's also, you were born to be a fisherman, as the fish was born to be a fish. And this idea of doing what you're made to do, doing what you were born to do, of just playing your role, being you in the grand scheme of things, even if that you, ultimately the design of that is going to be to die at the hands of the fisherman, like with the fish, that is your great nobility, right? There is beauty in doing what makes you you. And there, again, that's something I really like about that particular quote.
Well, and then the daily aspect of it, he just went out fishing every day, and he was considered unlucky, but it was the habit. He was in the habit of doing the daily fishing. And so this glimpse we get in this book is of a super intense period of his fishing life, which is just, a couple days at most. But that's the quote you just read. What I love about this, it brings back that grittiness of his thought process during this whole time, because it's like super intense. So he's got kind of these wild thoughts, but they're very good thoughts too. It's like everything in his life has led up to this, but it was the daily practice that led up to this. It wasn't just a lucky day. It was a whole life building to this, and then all of his thought process is part of that as well.
Yeah, I think so. And again, there so much of this beyond the daily stuff and all this gets back to again living now and loving and respecting the now, right? Mm-hmm. What you have now. And again, you get back to the man talks about his love for the fish, right? Mm-hmm. And his respect for the fish. That's in my quote. I love you and respect you very much, but I will kill you dead before this day ends. And then later on, as he's reflecting on it, he says, you loved him when he was alive, and you loved him after. If you love him, it is not a sin to kill him, or is it more? And then, again, he reflects. Besides, he thought, everything kills everything else in some way. Fishing kills me exactly as it keeps me alive. And then you have that little correction. The boy keeps me alive, he thought. I must not deceive myself too much. That to me, like that line, everything kills everything else in some way. So he's talking about loving and respecting the fish, and it's not a sin to kill him. Well, everything kills everything else in some way. Fishing kills me as exactly as it keeps me alive, right? But then, no, actually, it's the boy who keeps me alive. So much of the philosophy of the book is wrapped up in that quote. And actually, I think, you know what? I'm going to correct it. That's my favorite quote from this book. It's that little wrapped up, everything kills everything else in some way. Fishing keeps me alive, or fishing kills me as it keeps me alive. Oh, wait, no, the boy keeps me alive. I must not deceive myself too much. Those lines are so, there's so much richness there in what he's doing. It's just, yeah. I just think he really gets to the sort of yin and yang of nature and our interactions with nature and all these other things, and then the social stuff that really is what keeps us alive and makes us human.
Yeah, I liked it. The other quote I really liked was while he's in the process of trying to land this fish up closer to the boat, he says, "No one is worthy of eating him from the manner of his behavior and his great dignity." And that was cool. And it goes back to what we were talking about. He just had such deep respect for the fish, even though he was about to kill him. Did you ever read Moby Dick?
I have not, and that's another one that is on my list for post-dissertation, post-PhD reading.
Yeah.
That is one of those classics that you have to read, but I haven't read it. So you can go ahead and fill in what connections you can make here.
Well, and I read that half a lifetime ago, but it was around the time that I read The Old Man and the Sea, and what I do remember is that same level of respect. There's this violent action of actually killing these beautiful whales, but the respect that these people have for the whales comes through in the writing, and remind me a lot of The Old Man and the Sea, and the respect that the old man has for the marlin, and the beauty of it. And then just the in Moby Dick as well, like they see the whale, they look in the whale's eyes, and here the marlin comes up out of the boat, and the old man and the marlin look at each other eye to eye. I mean, that is just the coolest thing. They're in a massive tug of war here. Who's gonna survive? And one's in the ocean, one's above, and they get the chance to look at each other eye to eye.
Yeah, size each other up and kind of respect one another.
Yep.
Yeah, there's just, again, it's so rich. There's so much there, and I suppose now is as good a time as any for us to kind of move back to the big picture, come back to some conclusions or concluding thoughts as we wrap up this podcast. This one obviously being a little bit shorter than the first one, more in line with what we're going to expect. I think most of the time, but. Go ahead. Any other big picture thoughts that you have on this book? Anything else that you've got as a burning in the chest to discuss?
Not really. Just nothing big. Just some of these small little pieces throughout the book of descriptions. One, he talks about the fish when he would bring fish in after catching them, and their unintelligent eyes. And if you've ever been fishing and you see the fish, I mean, that is the most perfect description of a fish. They have eyes, but they're unintelligent. I mean, it's like there's nothing going on in them. And this book was just stock full of those types of 2-word type of descriptions that you're like, man, that I don't know how he just did that, but that just perfectly describes what he's talking about. So I love talking about this book with you to think more about the boy and the old man and the relationship there, and what I think we had talked about this maybe yesterday as well, but just almost a passing off of the baton as well. And the old man, he knows he's coming to the end of his life. and passing that knowledge on to the boy, but the boy also giving a lot to the old man, and so despite the age difference, there being a very important mutual relationship of learning from both sides. Not that the old man had it all together and was only teaching, but that the old man was learning from the boy and the boy learning from the old man.
Yeah, just so much intergenerational cooperation. And yeah, I think that's a pretty good place to at least come close to leaving off. I think the other thing that I was thinking about at this point is the interesting thing about how it mentions at one point that the old man no longer dreamed of storms, nor of women, nor of great occurrences, nor of great fish, nor flights, nor contests of strength, nor of his wife. He only dreamed of places now, and of the lions on the beach. They played like young cats in the dusk, and he loved them as he loved the boy. He never dreamed about the boy, right? There's something, again, that, first of all, Hemingway kind of recognizes that our dreams, even, our unconscious dreams, our unconscious mind and where it chooses to dwell changes over time. And sometimes we can't even figure out, like, why is it that suddenly, instead of dreaming about my wife or whatever, I'm dreaming about these lions on the beach that I saw when I was a young man and them playing around. And again, it gets to this larger sort of interconnection kind of concept. And again, you I think flagged very well in this segment this interconnection, not just with nature and all this, but between generations, and just so much of this book is dealing with those, with the web of being in this world, and there's so much beauty to that. So I think we probably should just leave it with that, and encourage anybody who hasn't read this to read it. And those of you who have read it before, again, this is a good one to read meditatively, and to get a chance maybe to read before you go to bed, or to read when you have a little bit of time on the beach or somewhere else, or somewhere where you can have some silence and get the chance to sort of practice the mindfulness with Hemingway by reading this book. I think there's a lot to that. Yeah,
and I really want to listen to it as well. The Charlton Heston version, that sounds like it would be amazing.
Charlton Heston. You've been in Charleston a few too many times lately.
Oh yeah.
I said it the other day too.
When I said it, I was like, that didn't sound right. But one final thought for me as well is, when I was reading it this time, I was thinking how awesome it'll be to read this to my daughter in the near future. She's 2.5. I want to read it to her sometime soon, and I read it during college, and then I just read it again for this. That was half a lifetime ago, so it was interesting to me just to read it earlier and then to read it now, and I can't wait to read it again in the future, maybe 10 years from now, but then also to read it with my daughter along the years, and see how the meaning changes for her, what she gets out of it the first time, what she gets out of it the next time. It's such a short book that it's something you can just pick up and read in an hour or two. I think it'll be really neat to do that with my daughter as well.
To read it with her before you take her on a fishing trip, right?
Yeah. Let's go catch a marlin.
Yeah, there you go. All right, well, that's going to do it for us today. Now, once again, before we get out of here, just a reminder that you can follow along with us at booksoftitans.com, and of course, ping us on Twitter or on Instagram at Books of Titans. And if you haven't done so already, you can subscribe to this podcast and find all one of our past episodes through iTunes, the Android marketplace, or your podcast manager of choice.
And if you're enjoying the podcast, please make sure to give it effusive 5-star ratings on iTunes and share your favorite episodes on social media. We'll be back soon to discuss the new book, which will be The 22 Immutable Laws of Marketing. On behalf of Jason Staples, I'm Erik Rostad, and this has been the Books of Titans podcast. Thanks for listening.
I made this.